Okay, I might invite Jefa to turn his camera on as well. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at the Gender Justice in Disaster Inspiring Action Conference, everyone. I am Nikhila Madabhushi, and I'll be your moderator for this session. In case you're wondering who I am, I'm currently Innovation Fellow at Monash University and a practicing architect, and I'll share a little more about what I'm up to in the panel happening next. Before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Yalukit Willam Bunwurrung as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. These are two of the 5 major language groups of the Greater Kulin Nation on which Melbourne is situated, and we pay our respects to their land, water, their ancestors and their elders, past, present, and into the future. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which all of you have joined us today come from, as well as those who might watch a recording of this event, as well as those who are participating. So a bit of housekeeping. I encourage you to ask questions in this session by using the Q&A feature rather than the chat box. Vanessa, I think, is putting in some instructions on how to do that in the chat now. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our esteemed keynote speaker, Jefa Greenaway, who'll be sharing a little of his wisdom on design equity in the First Nations space. Thank you, Jefa.
So hopefully that's come up now and all good to go. So thank you for having me, and pleasure to be here and to contribute to the conversation. So I've titled this presentation, Speaking Truth to Architecture in Pursuit of Indigenous Design Equity. And hopefully this will make more sense as we traverse through the presentation. And I think it's always nice to start with language. So Yama Malia, or hello friend. And the way in which this presentation has been organised is I'm taking you on a bit of a journey, and the journey is going to focus on a series of provocations supported by a couple of case studies, and very much sort of building upon a perspective of an Indigenous design practitioner. And I guess in some respects, the approach I take seeks to sort of invert the way in which we frame connection, particularly to Indigenous culture in the Australian context. And to that end, it's always important to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we're gathering, those of the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that I'm located here on unceded sovereign lands of the Kulin Nation. And so as part of cultural protocol, it's always important to explain who's your mob and where you're from. And so to give some sense to that, my mob is Walwong Kamilaroi country, which is in northwest New South Wales, being the 2nd largest language group in the state of New South Wales. And always important to, demonstrate some of those cultural connections. And so my connection through my father being a significant Aboriginal figure in Australian history. So he was there in the National Day of Mourning in 1938. He signed up as a soldier in the Second World War. He lobbied for 67 referendum for a decade and was mentored by people like William Cooper, and in turn mentored people like Charlie Perkins and Gary Foley. And so that link through history is really important for me in certainly acknowledging and remembering those trailblazers who opened the doors for people from my generation particularly and beyond. On my mother's side, they came here after the Second World War from war-torn Germany, and was in fact the only ship to have sunk en route to Australia in that influx of migration post-Second World War. And so I very much draw upon this blended heritage, and it's certainly something that informs my mode of practice. And people often ask how one sort of describes oneself, and I describe it through the 3 A's. Firstly, I'm trained as an architect, and so I'm also a director of and co-founder of Greenaway Architects, which has been in practice for over 2 decades now. And so we certainly look at practice through a particular lens, being a holistic approach to design thinking, which embeds and infuses a non-silo-based approach to design. So that includes architecture, interior design, landscape design, urban design, as a real integrated way of practice. The other hat that I wear is as an academic, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne. And my current role is in fact to indigenise the design degree and infuse Indigenous perspectives, sensibilities and knowledge systems through design education. And the other hat that I wear is as an advocate. And so along with Ruben Berg, we established the only peak design body that represents Indigenous design practitioners in the country, known as Indigenous Architecture and Design Victoria, or IADV. And what we've really sought to do is to role model and to mentor young practitioners, to showcase to the design profession the value of Indigenous design thinking and knowledge systems to inform the places and spaces in which we live. And that certainly is an important role in terms of communication and advocating towards improving opportunities for Indigenous people within the design professions. And importantly, I start with a provocation and a question. And it really is centred on the challenges ahead, but also how we listen to country, how we design with country, and how we think about healing country. So we're seeing in the current scenario and current context that there are a flood of residential projects being stimulated, particularly in a post-COVID environment. We're seeing major infrastructure projects for community in regional centres. We're seeing a lot of projects within our major metropolises, including sites of significance like the Melbourne Cemetery, which is undergoing a master plan and actually sits on the site of the former cemetery of Melbourne, including Aboriginal skeletal remains. We see major infill development sites adjacent to sites of significance like the Birrarung or the Yarra River, as it's better known. We're also boring through terra firma and boring through country with major infrastructure projects like roads, train lines, tunnels and the like. Yet if we pause and reflect on the realities, we can certainly frame it through the lens that all projects which are built in the Australian context are in reality built on Indigenous lands. And so in the Victorian context, there are 38 distinct language groups, and the Greater Kulin Nation, which makes up Melbourne and its surrounding areas, is made up of 5 distinct language groups. And so what I seek to do in the sort of practice that I engage with is to build upon and acknowledge the deep wisdom and history of 67,000 years of continuous connection to this country. And when we start to scratch the surface, we start to reveal layers of history and memory of place. And so as it relates to my country, Gamilaroi country, you can see here through this particular image that through the frontier wars, there was actually intensification of significant massacre sites, and they are dotted throughout the landmass of Australia. Further to that, we can also see in this image here the preponderance of missions and reserves where Indigenous people were corralled in particular locations. And so again, that starts to inform the way we think about place making and design. And so in the Victorian context, again, we can see the impact of the sort of colonial project and its implications on Indigenous peoples. And importantly, there is a degree of cultural amnesia and a reluctance to confront some of these difficult truths. And we can see the importance of how we engage with protecting culture. And so the perfect example in recent times is the Juukan Gorge scenario, whereby a significant cultural site was detonated to make way for a mine. And so again, we can see how the impacts of a lack of protection around culture and how that is actually part of our shared heritage is engaged with. And certainly I think 2020 was a tipping point and a moment, and we saw it particularly through the Black Lives Matter movement, which demonstrated in some regards a reckoning of history. And so how we start to challenge some of the understandings of the implications upon particularly minority groups and people who don't have a voice. And so how do we start to change the conversation and acknowledge some of the challenges ahead? And so another important initiative was the Architects Declare initiative, which Greenaway Architects was a founding signatory. And what that seeks to do is foreground some of the implications of design practice on biodiversity loss and also climate change. And it demonstrates that in many respects, we operate within a social license or a social contract. And so if we start to reveal some of the realities, as best as we can determine, there's probably only ever been somewhere in the order of 25 Indigenous people to have graduated from schools of architecture nationally ever. And so there has certainly been some conversations in recent times of whether there is an opportunity to move beyond what I call the ochre ceiling and look at facilitating this notion of design equity. And importantly, we're certainly seeing a number of projects whereby there is an acknowledgement and a desire to meaningfully engage with the narratives of place. And so whether it's the Tunaminaway Mulbohina Memorial, which is in fact the first site for a public execution in Melbourne, whether it's enveloping things like markers in the landscape, which in some respects highlight some inaccuracies in terms of how we frame and understand history. But certainly there's a number of practitioners who are confronting some of these challenges of how we can engage deeply and how we can certainly foreground the opportunities to embed new conversations around our deeper history. And so I certainly believe that architectural design practitioners, artists and other creatives have an opportunity to showcase through their voice and through innovation and, certainly powerful propositions to start to engage in ways where we start to, build upon the nuance of history. And so what we're also seeing is that the peak design bodies are starting to engage with these conversations, whether it's through reconciliation action plans like is been organised in recent times through the Institute of Landscape Architects, whether it's the PIA's affirmation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, or whether it's the Institute of Architects developing a First Nations cultural reference panel and advisory group. And what we're also seeing is within academia and through design schools that there needs to be a new way in which we confront some of these difficult truths, but also to engage in a much more equitable framing of design practice. And what we're also seeing is a real thirst and an appetite to engage with these premises and thematics through publications, through different conversations, through policy and other dimensions. And significantly within the Victorian context, we are very progressive in our thinking in as much as we have actually legislated for treaty conversations. We've created a First Nations or First Peoples Assembly. We've also recently announced a Truth and Justice Commission. So what this presupposes is my next provocation, which is how might design change in the age of treaty? And how does the built environment disciplines need to adapt and change to meet that new reality on the horizon? And I think the subsequent quote very much captures the sort of sentiment of an Indigenous lens on the built environment. If nothing of your culture, history, language or art is visible in the streets, parks and buildings where you live, how can you ever feel welcome there? And this quotation from the Indigenous Placemaking Council very much reinforces why Black design matters. And what it really reinforces for me is that there is a great degree of sophistication and originality in Indigenous design thinking. And so we were the first stone engineers, we were the first bakers, we were the first ecologists on this grand landmass. And so we can see the remnants of history from the Wurdi Yuyang constellation, which is seen to be the equivalent of Australia's Stonehenge, being 11,000-year-old mapping of the solstice near Geelong. We also see it through the World Heritage listed Budgebim cultural landscape, which again demonstrates the richness, the depth of understanding of creating sophisticated aquaculture system, which is harvest lava stones from a volcanic eruption to create these channels for eels and aquatic life, to create permanent settlements and stone houses, which predate the pyramids and certainly challenges some of those stereotypes of how we frame culture, and demonstrates that there is certainly an ability to design and to create, very nuanced sort of modulation of communities, and in this instance estimated to be somewhere in the order of 400 to 1,000 people strong. And so starting to bring these to the surface and to tell these stories becomes certainly a powerful reminder of the strength of that sense of cultural continuity, and certainly acknowledging the contemporary reimaginings of Indigenous culture, and framing it through the lens of being unashamedly contemporary in our construction of identity and demonstrating that link through time. And so there is certainly a conversation being had around how we can very much delve deep, and how do we start to acknowledge some of those difficult truths, and how do we start to move beyond the cliche, the stereotypical, the muralisation of culture, if you will, to something which is much more embedded. And certainly, as I see it, the time is now to strengthen opportunities of meaningful contribution of Indigenous voices into design practice. And this is where I move to my third provocation, being how can Indigenous designers encode cultural responsiveness embedded within the built and natural environment? And I think the best way to really delve into this and unpack this is through a couple of case studies, and showcasing through projects which have been realised some of the ways and methodologies that I've employed through time, in terms of being an architectural practitioner. And the first case study is Nagara Place at RMIT University. And the inspiration of this particular project is looking at the 6 or the 7 seasons of the Kulin Nation. And what it seeks to do is start to engage with an understanding that Indigenous culture and art are inextricably linked. Art is culture, culture is art. Art is a tangible expression of culture. And so the way in which we went about this particular project was to encode it with memory and meaning of place, anchored in a connection to the Kulin Nation, celebrating cultural references and motifs in a bold and expressive way. And certainly what we also wanted to do was to engage with the bioregion in which the project is located, in the heart of Melbourne, in a busy university campus, and start to speak to the opportunity to engage with landscape, with culture, with cultural meaning. And to do this, what we sought to really respond to was the reference point of the Kulin calendar, but also to use a cultural palette of edible plants, medicinal plants, plants used for weaving, and then also to be expressive within this experience. So it became this sort of moment of pause and contemplation within this busy university campus, but also to create a number of moves which starts to celebrate culture. And so we were benefited by the fact that there was a large glazed facade adjacent to this landscape intervention. And so what we thought to do here was to create a little moment where we started to celebrate in an expressive way contemporary cultural expression. And so by graphically using that backdrop, we could start to say, well, this is a little moment which is a little bit different and distinct. And so the way in which we started to do this was to carve up the space and to create this graphic motif embedded and woven as part of the story. And so significantly, the way in which it was demarcated was to be carved up into those 6 domains, and then the facade became the sort of metaphor of the 7th season. And so then what we could do was to use interpretation and graphic motifs redolent of cultural expression of the Southeast. And so acknowledging that the cultural expression here is quite distinct and different, for instance, from the Central Desert. And this image here, I think, captures it quite nicely. Beyond the facade that you can see in the foreground is a building which has emblazoned on the facade the image of William Barry, a significant Wurundjeri elder, overlooking and protecting this site. And so as I guess, a cultural moment within the city, it becomes a powerful reminder of that sense of cultural continuity. And so you can see in this next image how we've created this little moment where we created a natural sort of amphitheatre. It becomes a gathering place. It becomes a place for ceremony, for teaching, a place for pause, but also very bold and engaging, and then starting to use the plant palette to be expressive of the seasonality quite distinct of this particular site. And so the fire pit again became an important, I guess, centrifugal force to the design ideation. And so that became again the opportunity to celebrate tradition and cultural connection as well. And so this project was exhibited in the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2018. But again, you can see how the focus of the fire pit became a welcoming gesture. And so the way in which it very much speaks to language, to culture, to seasonality, to the seasons of life and the sort of rhythms of life was very important, and building upon Indigenous knowledge systems as well. And so you can see here how the site is in fact used. So at the start of the academic year, traditional owners, and we can see Auntie Di Kerr, a significant Wurundjeri elder, welcoming students on campus as part of the normative experience of Indigenous culture, which I think very much aligns to the fact that we've created a pedagogical landscape, or a landscape of learning. And so this idea of knowledge exchange becomes very important, particularly in a site of learning, being a university campus. And this next image for me, I think very much sort of captures that intent, that idea of knowledge exchange, a place of learning, a place of pause, a place of gathering. And it's very much focused on people. But it's focusing on people, it's focusing on purpose, and it's focusing on place. And so those 3 pillars, if you will, very much anchors the design thinking for this particular project. While very small in scale, significant in terms of its intent and ambition, and supportive certainly of the reconciliation journey in which the university continues to traverse. And so these, I guess, final images very much capture the boldness, moving beyond the sort of typical university palette in terms of material selections and tones to something which is very bold, striking, colourful, and celebrating culture. And so this urban intervention is very much a gesture of reconciliation at scale. So the next project is sort of building up in scale and understanding the capacity of community to inform a clear design direction. And this project is the Koori Heritage Trust at Federation Square. And so a lot of the work that we do very much starts with a process of cultural mapping. And so even within a major city like Melbourne, we will see remnants of history. And so whether it's Aboriginal skeletal remains located within the city, whether it's references to the significant site of the Birrarung or the River of Mist as it's better known, and you know, as it's known now as the Yarra River, which traverses through the city, or whether there's contemporary markers in the landscape like the Barrack building, which I made reference of before, whether it's a series of river red gums which predate colonial settlement, estimated to be 300 to 400 years, or other markers like the Kulin Nation gathering place adjacent to where the MCG, the Melbourne Cricket Ground, is currently located, but also other places of significance, places of gathering like Bunjalaka at Melbourne Museum and the Koori Heritage Trust located in Federation Square. And so by way of some background, the original Koori Heritage Trust building was located in a colonial building, being a 3-storey warehouse, and it was repurposed by Gregory Burgess, the architect, in the sort of late 90s. And significantly, it was located on the metaphorical and literal fringes of the city. And so when they sold the building, they had an opportunity to bring it into the beating heart, being the cultural heart of Melbourne, being Federation Square. And so that's part of the cultural precinct of Melbourne. But importantly, we can see a couple of images here. The image on the right is in fact a scar tree which was located in the previous iteration of the Koori Heritage Trust on King Street on the fringes of the CBD. The image on the left is in fact a scar tree from the Wimmera River, about 3 hours west of Melbourne. And for me, it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the fact that Indigenous people were the first ecologists. So for instance, if you sought to make a canoe, you would not cut down the tree to remove the bark. You would only remove that which you need. And so what that does, it becomes a mnemonic marker in the landscape. And so over time, what would happen is that scar would grow together and it would become but a slit in the tree. But it became this memory marker. And importantly, what it demonstrates is the sustainable design practice embedded within sort of cultural understanding that you'll certainly seek to preserve and to protect culture and the environment. Yet the scar tree on the right, the community had a very close cultural attachment. And so they wanted to bring it across into the new facility at Federation Square within the heart of Melbourne. But what a lot of people didn't realise, that it was in fact an artifice. It was a casting of a scar tree from the Wimmera River, wrapped around a steel armature and using fiberglass, and then creating through a sort of hand-painted reconstruction of the scar tree. But importantly, what you can see, this vertical circulation preambulates around this scar tree, and sitting atop of it is Bunjil the eagle, the creator spirit of the Kulin Nation. So subtly, you are in fact being protected, and through this reference to this important totemic reference of the Kulin Nation, you are being protected. And so we wanted to take this idea and to bring it across into the new facility. And the process in which we employed was this notion of adaptation. And so the image on the left is a parrying shield hand carved by William Barrack. And so you can see the cultural motif of the shield and the line work, very much redolent of cultural expression of the Southeast. The image in the centre is a dendroglyph, or a carved tree. So you can see where the bark has been removed, leaving the scar. And then within that scar is some carvings. And those carvings within those scar trees are spatial markers of places of importance, like burial grounds for significant elders, or places of significance like corroboree grounds or gathering places. The image on the right is a contemporary reconstruction of the scar tree. So creating this constructed environment within the interior of the space at Federation Square. And so these ideas, these cultural motifs, have been infused within the fabric of the building. And further to that, taking on board that idea of the scar tree, we designed what we called the gathering table. And the gathering table sought to create a sense of cultural equity, where people gather around this table for different purposes. It might be a weaving workshop. It might be to showcase the cultural collection of this keeping place within this 4.5 metre long, 2-tonne piece of customised joinery evoking the scar tree, using river red gum veneer to very much strengthen that idea of the scar tree, but then creating a shape and a form which evokes the canoe. And so sitting within this cultural landscape was this idea of capturing a moment within the experience where we start to evoke a river narrative. And so what you'll also see is this sinuous display cabinet which showcases the cultural collection. And importantly, in behind those glazed cabinets is actually the inner workings of this cultural collection and this cultural keeping place. And so importantly, the staff members who come and work within this particular place are reminded each and every day of the importance of their role as protectors of culture. So they're in fact enveloped by the collection of which they're the custodians. And so by creating this artificial constructed landscape, we're evoking the river, of the banks of the river at the base of this display cabinet. We ground back the concrete to create Wash River pebbles as a sort of idea of water, and then sitting within this landscape is this gathering table. And then beyond, you can see dotted through this constructed landscapes are those adapted reimaginings of a contemporary scar tree. And so put together as a sort of cohesive design narrative is this idea of the water. And so this diagram here, I think, captures that understanding of its proximity to the Birrarung or the Yarra River. And so this building previously turned its back on the river, the lifeblood of community. And so by reorganising and reorientating the project, we could start to talk to this water story. We could celebrate those little moments of understanding and history, and starting to sort of riff off this idea of the Birrarung as being instrumental to the design inspiration for the project. And so building upon this, what we certainly sought to do was to engage with traditional knowledge systems, to listen to the elders, to engage deeply with the cultural story, with the requisite permissions of traditional owners, to very much celebrate and engage with the deep history of country. And so these subsequent images very much focus on this idea of how do we find ways to amplify culture? How do we really celebrate some of those notions of an understanding of culture? So for instance, in this image, you can see beyond a series of working stations. And so we could have bought some standard module workstations for staff, but what we did is we created these customised workstations with these dividers. And these dividers, in fact, create a sectional view through the river, showing the evolution of the Birrarung or the Yarra River through time, and talking to an understanding of the importance of the landscape and of country. And so again, as the staff members sit at their computers, they're actually looking through the river at eye level. And so again, you can see the inner workings of this cultural institution by creating those glaze apertures to really understand and see how culture is preserved and protected. And so this keeping place showcases and celebrates art and culture, and certainly and importantly, it's a gathering place. And so the connection to people is equally as important as the artifacts in which it houses. And so what it also does is it becomes a connector of people, a connector of culture, and a connector of stories. And further to that, what we wanted to do was to imbue it with these subtle ideas of culture. And so we can see here an image of Uncle Max Dalamannaman Harrison, a Yuin elder. And he's here on the Shoalhaven River welcoming us to country. And so he's burning the leaf of the manna gum, and it smokes the green leaf. And so as you were smoked, you are invited onto country, and you are engaging with an ancient traditional practice. The image here is in fact the blossom of the manna gum. And so what we wanted to do certainly was to encode a sense of a welcome as you come into the Koori Heritage Trust project. And so as you come and cross that threshold, you are subtly being welcomed to country. And so by using this sort of abstracted adaptation of the blossom of the manna gum, you're being reminded, even though it's not spelt out explicitly, you are subtly being welcomed onto country. And so to sum up, some of the key and important elements that I want to sort of reinforce is this notion of what I call Indigenous design thinking. And so in a typical sense, we tend to have this idea that somehow, the architect or the engineer or the procurement body is the sort of the hero in the story. And what we encourage, particularly when we engage with Indigenous knowledge systems, is that in many respects, the architect or the designer needs to park their ego at the door. And the reason why I say that is because we're very much reliant upon Indigenous knowledge holders to pass on and to be generous in their capacity to share knowledge. And so often we are therefore the least knowledgeable person in the room as it pertains to Indigenous knowledge. And so often through the built environment discipline, we tend to think in very linear ways. We design it, we document it, we build it. It's that simple. But when we engage with Indigenous design thinking, we need to start with listening deeply. We'll invariably engage with history and memory of place and country. And ideally, we will provide opportunities to skill up and to empower community and to facilitate meaningful agency and voice. And invariably, we will engage with issues of social justice. And it's not until we go on this circuitous journey will we even be able to really consider this notion of placemaking and design. And ideally, what we'll also do is to co-design and acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous voice in this journey. And ideally, what we seek to do is to move beyond a transactional model to a relational model. And this is where we start to build and strengthen relationships and create a meaningful legacy over time. And so if I could sort of sum it up through a series of key items to sort of leave you with, it is to acknowledge the country in which a project is located as a way of strengthening and healing country. To reveal the layers of history and memory of place will invariably make the invisible visible. And along this journey, we should have the courage to embed a level of truth-telling. And as we start to move towards treaty conversations, this becomes even more significant and relevant. And ideally, what we'll seek to do is to embed and infuse Indigenous agency along the entire journey of a proposition, and to engage deeply with Indigenous knowledge keepers. And certainly and importantly, we've come, I think, to a level of cultural maturity whereby we can move beyond the deficit discourse around Indigenous culture and to celebrate and embrace our shared humanity and understand that we have a deep history of which we all share. And to end there, I'd just like to say, Maru Yania will go well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jefa, for your engaging presentation. I think we are getting really close to the time that we have to wrap up your keynote, but I feel like we've got a couple of minutes to take a question, if that's okay. And maybe some of the other ones we can't answer, we can perhaps take into the panel session as well. But one question I thought I'd ask, because it sort of relates to the sort of broader themes of this conference, is Uncle Stuart and Auntie Joyce are named in one of the plans. And so the question is, how does gender, so, you know, male, female, LGBTIQA plus, factor in your work and Indigenous architecture more generally?
Well, I think really it's centering on this notion of design equity. And I think importantly, design practice has tend to sort of privilege a sort of white middle class male perspective on design practice. And importantly, my sort of methodology is to embrace many voices, and that includes certainly gender, it includes Indigenous voices, it includes understanding that we need to reflect the community in which we're a part of. And so I think certainly there is a role to play to embed non-Western perspectives in design practice and to broaden the frame of reference of how we understand the contribution and role of design as being an enabler to facilitate equity, and certainly understanding that we need to also move beyond a sort of an anthropocentric focus, but to understand a broader contribution of a sort of holistic approach to country. So understanding the impact that we have on the environment, on the flora and fauna, and that certainly we operate within that social contract.
Sure, Jefa. And so I guess it's a question of what you're getting at is process, like broadening the processes by which we're actually engaging in architectural practice and sort of changing it if we need to, depending on the context, in order to allow broader voices to come in. And I think...
Yeah, certainly. And I think in some respects, we tend to privilege the artifact over the journey of how we get to the end product. And sometimes it actually involves not building anything. It might be about creating platforms or programs or other opportunities which isn't necessarily a built form outcome. And it's understanding and listening deeply to the community in which we engage with and reflecting their aspirations and ambitions rather than our own ego.
Yeah, great. Look, I'm conscious that it's 1:45 and we have to have a tiny break before the panel, but I look forward to talking about this more in our next session in several minutes. So thank you, everyone, for coming along, and thank you most of all, Jefa, for your presentation. We will see you all again shortly. Thank you.